Welcome to True Crime Kin channel, where we dive into real stories that shake the core of human relationships. Today's case is one of shocking betrayal, twisted emotions, and a tragic ending that no one saw coming. So let's begin. Jason and Sarah's marriage had always appeared perfect on the outside. They had been together for 5 years, living in a comfortable suburban home, with Jason working as a software engineer and Sarah as a marketing professional. Their relationship wasn't without its challenges, but they had weathered storms together until the baby arrived. When Sarah told Jason she was pregnant, he was ecstatic. The idea of starting a family had always been a dream of his. He imagined playing catch with his son, teaching him how to ride a bike and guiding him through life. For Jason, fatherhood represented a new chapter of love and responsibility. But from the moment Oliver was born, Jason couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Oliver's features didn't resemble his own. The baby had dark eyes and thick black hair, in stark contrast to Jason's light brown hair and blue eyes. Jason initially dismissed his doubts as paranoia. After all, newborns can change as they grow. However, the doubts persisted. Jason's insecurities began to eat away at him. Every time a stranger commented that Oliver didn't look like him, Jason felt a stab of fear. What if he wasn't the father? Finally, after weeks of torment, Jason made a decision that would change everything. He secretly took a strand of Oliver's hair and sent it off for a paternity test. The results came in a week later, and they confirmed Jason's worst nightmare. He wasn't Oliver's biological father. Shock gave way to anger and anger to devastation. He confronted Sarah with the results, demanding answers. Sarah broke down in tears, confessing that she had had an affair with David, a co-worker she had grown close to during late nights at the office. It had been a terrible mistake, she said, one that she deeply regretted. She had hoped the baby was Jason's and had prayed that her secret would never come out. But now it had. And their world was in pieces. Jason was shattered. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The baby he had doted on wasn't his, and the life he had envisioned was a lie. Sarah begged for forgiveness, swearing that she wanted to make things right. She pleaded with Jason to stay, to try and rebuild their marriage. After a long silence, Jason made a decision. He would stay. But he wasn't staying out of love or forgiveness. He was staying for revenge. Jason's rage became his constant companion. While Sarah tried to mend their broken marriage, Jason quietly plotted his revenge. He kept his emotions buried deep, maintaining the facade of a husband willing to move past the affair. He even agreed to go to marriage counseling, nodding along to the therapist's advice about healing and rebuilding trust. But inside, Jason was seething. He couldn't forget the betrayal, couldn't erase the image of Sarah with another man. Every time he looked at Oliver, he was reminded of David. The pain was unbearable. But Jason channeled it into something darker, a meticulously calculated plan to destroy the people who had hurt him. Jason began following David in secret, tracking his movements and learning everything he could about the man. David was the paragon of success. He was well liked at work, happily married with 2 children, and respected in his community. He had no idea that Jason was watching him, biding his time. In the meantime, Jason subtly planted seeds of doubt in Sarah's mind. He would casually mention things that made her question her own sanity. "Didn't you say David texted you today?" he would ask, knowing full well that he had been the one sending the messages from a burner phone. Sarah became increasingly paranoid. She started to believe that David hadn't really ended the affair, that he was trying to manipulate her. Jason's psychological games took their toll on her, driving a wedge between her and everyone around her. She grew anxious, constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid of being exposed. Meanwhile, Jason's rage festered. He couldn't let go of the idea that David had taken something from him, his wife, his future, his pride. And now Jason would take something from him. Jason's plan moved to the next stage. He knew that simply destroying Sarah's mental state wasn't enough. He wanted David to suffer, to feel the same loss and pain that he had felt. And so he decided to confront David, but not in a way that would give him a chance to fight back. Late one night, Jason followed David to a downtown hotel. He had carefully orchestrated the situation by sending a fake message to Sarah, making it look like David had asked her to meet him there. Sarah, in a state of confusion, had agreed to go, thinking she needed closure. But when Jason arrived, he wasn't interested in a confrontation. He was interested in blood. David was alone in the hotel's underground parking garage when Jason approached him. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the concrete, and the air was thick with tension. David was about to unlock his car when Jason stepped out of the shadows, his face hidden by a hood. "David," Jason called out, his voice calm but cold. David turned, confused. "Jason, what are you doing here?" Without a word, Jason swung a metal pipe he had hidden behind his back, striking David on the side of the head. David collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him as he groaned in pain. Jason didn't hesitate. He struck again, this time harder, ensuring that David wouldn't get back up. David's body twitched one final time before going still. Jason stood over him, breathing heavily, watching the life drain from the man who had stolen his family. For a moment, Jason felt a rush of power, a dark thrill that came from ending a life. But it wasn't enough. He quickly wiped down the metal pipe in the area surrounding David's body, leaving no trace of his presence. He placed David's wallet and phone on the ground, staging the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. Then, with a final glance at the lifeless body, Jason disappeared into the night. The news of David's murder sent shock waves through the community. His death was a tragic mystery. With the police struggling to find any leads, the robbery theory seemed plausible, but something didn't sit right with Detective Evelyn Carter, the lead investigator on the case. Evelyn was known for her sharp instincts, and this case didn't feel like a random act of violence. The attack had been too precise, too controlled. There were no witnesses, no security footage, and the killer had left behind no evidence. It was as if David's murderer had vanished into thin air. Evelyn began digging deeper into David's life, hoping to find some clue that would explain why he had been targeted. That's when she uncovered the affair with Sarah. It was an open secret at David's workplace. Everyone knew he had been involved with Sarah, and some even whispered that the affair had caused tension in his marriage. Evelyn wondered if the affair might be the key to understanding David's death. She began looking into Sarah, her marriage to Jason, and any potential connections to the murder. As she pieced together the timeline of events, Evelyn grew suspicious. Jason had no alibi for the night of David's murder, and his reaction to David's death seemed too calm. He had been supportive of Sarah, but Evelyn sensed that there was something deeper behind his composed exterior. She decided to keep a close watch on Jason. If he was involved, he would slip up eventually, and when he did, Evelyn would be there to catch him. Jason had successfully eliminated David. But the satisfaction he had felt was fleeting. The anger and betrayal still simmered within him, and he knew he couldn't stop there. There were loose ends, people who might connect him to the crime. One of those people was Mark, a mutual friend of both David and Sarah. Mark had been close to David, and Jason suspected that he might know more about the affair than he was letting on. Mark had always been perceptive, the type of person who noticed the little details others missed. Jason couldn't afford to let Mark become a liability. Late one night, while Sarah was asleep, Jason left the house and drove to Mark's home. The streets were quiet, the darkness concealing his movements. He parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping to the shadows. When he reached Mark's house, Jason quietly broke in through a side window. The house was silent, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Jason made his way to the master bedroom where Mark was fast asleep. Jason stood over Mark for a moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest. He felt a flicker of hesitation. Mark had never wronged him personally, but that hesitation was quickly smothered by Jason's growing need for control. He couldn't afford to let anyone stand in his way. Without a second thought, Jason wrapped his hands around Mark's throat and squeezed. Mark's eyes flew open, filled with terror as he struggled to breathe. He thrashed and clawed at Jason's hands. But Jason's grip was unrelenting. Slowly, Mark's movements weakened, and his eyes glazed over as the life drained from his body. Jason stepped back, breathing heavily. The room was eerily quiet, except for the sound of Jason's ragged breaths and the ticking of the wall clock. Mark's lifeless body lay sprawled on the bed, his face frozen in a mask of fear. Jason wiped his hands on a cloth he had brought with him. then carefully staged the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. He scattered some of Mark's belongings around, overturned a few items, and left the door ajar. Jason slipped out of the house, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and dread. He drove back home, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. The second murder had been executed with the same cold efficiency as the first, but even as he tried to bask in the success, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The next morning, the news of Mark's death was all over the media. The authorities were baffled by the similarity to David's case. Both men had been close to Sarah. Both had been killed in seemingly random acts of violence. The police were under increasing pressure to solve the cases, and the community was gripped with fear. Jason watched Sarah's reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She was horrified and distressed, but she was also growing increasingly paranoid. Jason knew that the weight of the murders was pushing her closer to the edge. She was convinced that she was being targeted, that someone was out to get her. Jason played the role of the supportive husband, comforting her and assuring her that everything would be all right. He pretended to be just as shocked and devastated as she was, but every comforting word was a lie, masking the truth that he was the one behind the chaos. Detective Evelyn Carter had been working tirelessly on the case. She had become obsessed with finding the link between David's and Mark's murders. The similarities were too striking to ignore, and she began to suspect that there was a deeper connection. Her investigation led her to Sarah, and the affair with David was the missing piece of the puzzle. She interviewed Sarah, who was distraught but cooperative. Sarah's anxiety was palpable, and she spoke of feeling like she was being followed, of receiving strange messages. Evelyn dug into Sarah's background and discovered the affair. But she also noticed Jason's unusual calmness in the face of such tragedy. Jason had no solid alibi for the nights of the murders, and he seemed to have an unsettling detachment from the situation. The more Evelyn investigated, the more she grew convinced that Jason was hiding something. She began surveillance on him, monitoring his movements and interactions. She hoped that if she could find a slip or inconsistency, she could finally crack the case. Evelyn's instincts told her that Jason was connected to the murders, but she needed proof. She continued to dig, hoping that the right piece of evidence would surface. Jason was beginning to unravel. The pressure of maintaining his charade, coupled with the guilt of his actions, was starting to take a toll on him. The constant fear of being caught, combined with Sarah's growing paranoia, created an atmosphere of tension and distrust in their home. One evening, after another round of therapy and counseling sessions, Jason's mental state deteriorated further. He found solace in alcohol, using it as a means to escape his spiraling thoughts. He would sit in the living room, the room dimly lit, nursing a drink while staring blankly at the television. The soothing buzz of the alcohol did little to drown out the haunting memories of his victims' faces. Sarah, increasingly worried about Jason's erratic behavior, tried to reach out to him. She had noticed the signs of his breakdown, but didn't understand the root cause. She grew fearful for both her and Oliver's safety, especially with Jason's erratic outbursts and the growing tension in their home. One night, Sarah found Jason in a particularly distressed state. He was rambling incoherently about revenge and how they deserved it. The incoherent ramblings made Sarah uneasy. She had been trying to understand the source of his anger, but found herself unable to connect the dots. In a fit of desperation, Sarah confronted Jason, demanding to know what was wrong. Jason, drunk and emotional, began to unravel. He was so far gone that he couldn't maintain his facade any longer. He told Sarah about the affair and how he had planned revenge, not just on David, but on anyone who could potentially connect him to the crime. Sarah was horrified by the confession. The weight of the truth hit her like a freight train. She was overwhelmed with fear and disbelief. The man she had once loved, the man who had promised to protect her, was now a monster. She struggled to process the information, paralyzed by the enormity of Jason's actions. The night after Jason's confession, Sarah was a bundle of nerves. The shock of learning that Jason was responsible for the murders had left her unable to think clearly. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend what her life had become. Jason, on the other hand, felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had finally revealed the truth, exposing the dark side of his soul that he had been hiding for so long. He felt a sick sense of power in his confession, even as he saw the terror in Sarah's eyes. Sarah didn't know what to do. She wanted to run to take Oliver and escape, but the fear of Jason's wrath held her back. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, unable to escape the man who had turned their lives into a living hell. Jason tried to justify his actions, explaining how the betrayal had driven him to seek revenge. He talked about how he had wanted to make Sarah suffer, to take away everything she held dear. He relished the look of horror on her face, enjoying the power he had over her. But the joy of confession was short-lived. Jason knew that the walls were closing in. Detective Carter's investigation was closing in on him, and he had to act quickly to avoid capture. He began making plans to cover his tracks and eliminate any remaining evidence. Jason's plan for revenge wasn't over. He knew that Sarah's growing paranoia would eventually lead her to make a desperate move. If she spoke to the police or sought help, his carefully constructed facade would crumble. He couldn't let that happen. He decided to take matters into his own hands. One evening, while Sarah was out running errands, Jason prepared to finalize his plan. He meticulously cleaned the house, removing any traces of his involvement in the murders. He destroyed incriminating evidence and ensured that every detail was accounted for. When Sarah returned home, she found Jason waiting for her. He had a cold, calculating look in his eyes, a stark contrast to the man she had once known. He informed her that they needed to leave to go somewhere safe. He fabricated a story about threats from an unknown source, claiming that their safety was at risk. Sarah, terrified and desperate, agreed to leave with Jason. She was too afraid to question him, too frightened to challenge his authority. They packed a few belongings and left the house, not knowing that Jason had already planned their final destination. Jason drove them to a remote cabin in the woods, a place he had rented under a false name. The isolation was perfect for his final act of revenge. As they arrived, Sarah's anxiety grew. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest. With no one in sight for miles, Jason played the concerned husband, reassuring Sarah that everything would be all right. He promised her that they would be safe here, away from the threats that he had fabricated. But as the night wore on, Sarah began to sense that something was terribly wrong. Jason had been preparing for this moment for days. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail, ensuring that there would be no escape. He knew that Sarah would eventually figure out his plan, and he needed to act before she could alert the authorities. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, Jason made his move. He approached her with a cold determination, his face betraying no emotion. Sarah, still trying to process the events of the past few days, had no idea what was coming. Jason confronted her, telling her that their marriage had to end. He had planned to frame Sarah for the murders, making it look like she had gone mad and committed the crimes out of jealousy and rage. He had already planted evidence in the cabin to make his story believable. In a moment of desperation, Sarah tried to defend herself, but Jason overpowered her. He had carefully prepared for this final confrontation, and he was determined to see it through to the end. Detective Evelyn Carter had been tracking Jason's movements closely. Her surveillance had led her to the remote cabin, where she had followed them under the guise of a routine check. She had grown increasingly convinced that Jason was behind the murders, and was determined to catch him in the act. As she approached the cabin, she heard raised voices and struggled to make out what was happening inside. The sounds of a struggle reached her ears, and she knew that time was running out. She called for backup and moved in cautiously. Inside the cabin, Jason was in the midst of his final confrontation with Sarah. He had just begun to plant the evidence when the police arrived. The sound of sirens and flashing lights startled Jason, who realized that his carefully constructed plan was unraveling. In the chaos that followed, Jason tried to flee, but Detective Carter was quick to apprehend him. She found Sarah bruised and shaken but alive, and immediately called for medical assistance. Sarah's ordeal was far from over, but at least she was safe from Jason's wrath. Jason was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial was a media sensation, with the details of his crimes making headlines across the country. The revelations about his actions and the motivations behind them shocked the public. Jason's trial was a spectacle of legal drama and emotional testimony. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members of the victims and onlookers eager to see justice served. The details of Jason's crimes were laid bare, painting a chilling picture of a man consumed by anger and revenge, Sarah testified, her voice trembling as she recounted the horror she had endured. Her testimony was a powerful reminder of the devastating impact of Jason's actions. She spoke of her fear, her betrayal, and the ultimate cost of living with a monster. Jason's defense team tried to argue that he was a product of his circumstances, that his actions were the result of a broken marriage and personal trauma, but the jury was unmoved by the attempt to justify his behavior. The evidence against Jason was overwhelming, and the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Jason was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's gavel struck with finality, sealing Jason's fate and bringing some measure of closure to the victims' families. For Sarah, the journey to rebuild her life was just beginning. She faced the challenge of overcoming the trauma and finding a way to move forward. She sought therapy and support from loved ones, working to heal from the scars left by Jason's actions. The case left a lasting impact on the community, a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. Detective Evelyn Carter was hailed for her relentless pursuit of justice, and the case became a testament to the importance of uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried. Years had passed since the harrowing events that rocked the lives of Jason, Sarah, and those around them. The quiet, suburban neighborhood that had once been home to Jason and Sarah had slowly resumed its normal rhythm. But the shadow of Jason's crimes lingered, casting a long and somber pall over the community. Sarah had spent the intervening years rebuilding her life from the fragments left by Jason's betrayal. The process was neither quick nor easy. She sought professional therapy, which helped her navigate the labyrinth of her emotions in trauma. Through therapy, she began to understand the depths of her grief and the strength she possessed to overcome it. Her journey was punctuated by moments of despair, but she found solace in the support of friends and family who rallied around her. Oliver, the innocent child caught in the crossfire of adult betrayals, grew up under the care of Sarah and her new partner, David, a man who had shown her genuine kindness and respect. Sarah ensured that Oliver was shielded from the darker aspects of his early life, providing him with a stable and loving environment. She worked hard to make sure that Oliver knew he was cherished and loved, and she strived to give him a childhood filled with the joy and security he deserved. The community, meanwhile, had not forgotten the chilling details of the case. The local news often revisited the story, especially around the anniversaries of the murders. Jason's trial and the subsequent revelations had left an indelible mark on the town. There were whispers of the case in cafes and at neighborhood gatherings, reminders of the tragic events that had unfolded in their midst. The police force, especially Detective Evelyn Carter, were seen as heroes for their relentless pursuit of justice. Carter in particular received commendations and accolades for her work, and she continued to serve as a beacon of diligence and integrity in law enforcement. Jason's incarceration was another story. Life in prison was harsh, and the reality of his situation began to sink in with the passing of time. His appeals for a lighter sentence or reconsideration of his case were consistently denied. In prison, he was faced with the consequences of his actions, grappling with the stark reality of his choices. He lived out his days behind bars, haunted by the knowledge of the suffering he had caused and the life he had destroyed. For Sarah, the shadow of the past never entirely vanished, but she chose to face it with resilience. She became an advocate for victims of domestic violence and infidelity, using her experience to help others who found themselves in similar situations. Her work involved speaking engagements, participating in support groups, and contributing to initiatives aimed at raising awareness about the psychological and emotional impact of betrayal and trauma. Sarah's advocacy brought her some measure of peace. The work gave her a sense of purpose, helping others navigate their own paths to recovery. Her efforts were recognized and appreciated by many, and her story became a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption and healing. Even in the face of profound suffering, the case of Jason, David, and Mark remained a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. It served as a warning about the destructive potential of revenge and the far-reaching consequences of personal betrayal. The community, forever changed by the events, learned the value of vigilance, compassion, and understanding. As the years rolled on, the pain of the past faded into the background, but the lessons remained. The story of Jason's crimes became a part of the collective memory of the town, a powerful narrative that underscored the importance of facing adversity with courage and the enduring strength found in the pursuit of justice and personal healing. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.